Design and Deployment Considerations Phase 2, Proving the Technology. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at how we can prove that the technology works by deploying either a proof of concept, a proof of technology, or a pilot, or maybe actually a mix of all three. Then for the pilot phase, we're going to take a closer look at how to ensure a successful outcome for our project. We're going to look at three distinct paths we can take within the proving phase, and it might be the case that you don't need all of them. And in actual fact, it's often best to jump straight into the last one, the pilot, if you can, and look at deploying a pilot to try and save time and cost, and to actually get the end users engaged early on in the project. So let's take a look at the first of the techniques in proving the solution, and that's the POC. A POC, or proof of concept, typically refers to a partial solution, often built on any old hardware kicking about, which involves a relatively small number of users, usually within the confines of the IT department, acting in business roles to establish whether the system satisfies some aspect of the purpose it was designed for. Once proven, one of two things tends to happen. Firstly, nothing happens, as it's just the IT department playing with technology, and there wasn't a real business driver in the first place. This is usually down to the previous steps and not having a defined business case. In a similar way, by not having any success criteria, it will also fail, as you don't know exactly what you're setting out to prove. The second outcome is that the project moves into a pilot phase, which we will discuss later on in this section. You could of course consider moving directly into this phase and bypassing the POC altogether. Maybe a demonstration of the technology would suffice, and using a demo environment over a longer period would show you enough of how the technology works. So the next step is the proof of technology. In contrast to a POC, the objective of a POT, or proof of technology, is to determine whether or not the proposed solution or technology will integrate into your existing environment and therefore demonstrate compatibility. The objective is to highlight any technical problems specific to your environment, such as how your bespoke systems might integrate. As with the POC, a POT is typically run by the IT department and no business users would be involved. A POT is purely a technical validation exercise. Then finally, we move into the pilot phase. A pilot refers to what is almost a small-scale rollout of the end solution in a production-style environment to real users, which would show a limited scope of the intended final solution. The scope may be limited by the number of users who can access the pilot system, the business processes affected, or the business partners involved. The purpose of a pilot is to test in a production-like environment whether the system is working as it was designed to, while limiting business exposure and risk. It should also touch real users as to gauge the feedback from what they might ultimately become a live solution. This is a critical step in achieving success, as the users are the people that have to interact with the system on a daily basis, and the reason why you should set up some form of working group to gather their feedback. That would also mitigate project failure, as the solution may deliver everything the IT department could ever wish for, but when it goes live and the first user logs on and reports a bad experience or performance, you may as well have not bothered. The pilot should be carefully scoped, sized and implemented, which breaks down nicely into the following 4 steps for a successful pilot. So let's look at the pilot phase in a little bit more detail, as this is essentially going to be the foundation of your design. By now we have built the business case, understood what your current environment looks like, so no nasty surprises, and have your success criteria. Armed with all of these things, we're now going to move into the pilot phase. During the pilot phase there are 4 steps we're going to work through, starting with the first step, design. The pilot infrastructure should be designed on the same hardware platforms that the production solution is going to be deployed on. For example, the same servers and same storage. This takes into account any anomalies between platforms and configuration differences that could affect things such as scalability, or more importantly, performance. Even at the pilot stage, the design is absolutely key, and you should make sure you take into account the production design even at this stage. Why? Basically because many pilot solutions will end up going straight into production, and more users get added above and beyond those that were scoped for the pilot solution. It's great going live with the solution and not having to go back and rebuild it, but when you start to scale by adding more users and applications, you might have some issues due to the pilot sizing. It might sound obvious, but often with a successful pilot, the users just keep on using it, and therefore additional users get added. If it's only ever going to be a pilot, that's fine, but keep this in mind and bear this in mind. If you're planning on taking the pilot straight into production, then design it for production right at the very start. It is always useful to work from a prerequisite document to understand the different elements that need consideration in the design. And the next step is to deploy the pilot. In the deployment phase of the pilot, you're going to start building out the infrastructure, deploying test users, and building OS images, and then start testing. Next, we start to test the pilot deployment. During the testing phase, you need to work closely with the end users and your sponsors, showing them the solution and how it works, closely monitoring the users, and assessing the solution as it's being used. This allows you to keep in contact with the users and give them the opportunity to continually provide real-time feedback. This in turn allows you to answer questions and make adjustments and enhancements on the fly, rather than waiting until the end of the project only to be told it didn't work, or they just simply didn't understand something. This then leads us on to the last step, and that's reviewing the pilot. The final stage sometimes gets forgotten. You've deployed the solution, the users have been testing, and then it ends there for whatever reason. However, there's one very important last thing to do to enable you to move into production. You need to measure the user experience and the IT department's experience against the success criteria that you set out at the start. You need to get customer sign-off and agreement that you have successfully met all the objectives and requirements. If this is not the case, you need to understand the reasons why. Have you missed something in the use case? Have the user requirements changed? Or is it just simply a perception issue? Whatever the case, you need to cycle around the process again. Go back to the use case, understand and re-evaluate the user requirements, what it is that is seemingly failing or not behaving, and then tweak the design or make the required changes and get the whole solution tested again. So the first thing to measure is whether or not you have met and demonstrated the success criteria. If the answer to that question is no, then you need to cycle back to your success criteria and make sure you've not missed something. Once you have reviewed the success criteria and made any updates, then work through the pilot phase again until the success criteria have been met. With the success criteria now met, you can answer yes to the question and move on to the user acceptance. If the answer to this question is no, then you need to go back and look at your design and the use cases, update as necessary, and then redeploy to the end users. If you can answer yes to this question, then you can move to creating your production design based on the learnings from the pilot. In the next video, we're going to look at the final phase of the project process, and that's designing and deploying for production.